Hi guys, Andrew here with headphones.com. Welcome to the Headphone Show, and today we're going to take a look at the Moondrop X Crinacle Blessing to Dusk. This is a hybrid IEM that comes in right at around $330. Let's check it out. As a disclaimer, this unit was sent to me by Shenzhen Audio for evaluation, but I've not been paid to say anything in particular about it, and all thoughts and opinions are my own. Now, for anyone who's unaware, Crinacle is an IEM reviewer who has been now collaborating with two manufacturers to produce some IEMs, and I just want to let everybody know that, he is a friend of mine, and we've had him on the show, we've had him on the live stream a number of times as well, but that's not going to cause me to pull any punches on the Blessing to Dusk. I'm going to give it as fair an evaluation as I possibly can. So with the Dusk, this is actually his second collaboration. The first one was with Fearless with the Dawn, and basically what he's done with the Dusk is he's taken the original Blessing 2, which I have here, and he has tuned it a little bit more, or he's collaborated with the manufacturer to tune it a little bit more closely to his target preference. Now, to begin with, we have to talk a little bit about the box. This is what I imagine Crin would look like as a waifu. Now, I'm not sure if this is intended to be this. It's probably left up for interpretation, but yeah, I think the likeness is uncanny. Regardless, we're not here to look at the box art. We are here to evaluate and compare some IEMs, but I do want to let you guys know that it comes with all of the stuff that you would imagine. It comes with a whole bunch of tips. It comes with the same carry case that the original one does. It has this sort of lifeless, gray color going on that perfectly fits with my complete lack of personality. More important than the case, the carry case, in my opinion, is that the Blessing to Dusk comes with Crin's own frequency response chart. Now, if you guys are unfamiliar, I'm going to hold this up the right way. If you guys are unfamiliar with Crin's website, basically what he does is he's got a whole database full of IEM measurements and also now over-ear headphone measurements as well. So here's a version of it in color. So what this is essentially a printout of the graph. This one, interestingly, is done on the Gross RA0402, I believe, because it doesn't have the resonance at 8K, but we'll get into that because I've done measurements as well, and spoiler alert, they do match this one, so that's really, really cool. But the fact that this was included and that Moondrop has paid attention to this is fantastic, and I think this is something that all manufacturers should do. If you're going to be shipping a product and you've paid attention to measurements, which again is something that I think is fairly important, then it's awesome if you can include those measurements done on standardized measurement rig in the box and let everybody know, hey, this is what it's supposed to sound like. Okay, moving on to the IEMs themselves. This is exactly the same housing structure and the same cable and the same ergonomics as the original Blessing 2. For me, that's actually a really good thing because I do find these to be quite comfortable, but for some people, the nozzle may be a little bit on the thick side. It's definitely a bit of a big boy there for the nozzle. For whatever reason, I never had any fit issues with this, and even there are other IEMs that don't have as big a nozzle, like the Final Audio A8000 that I have way harder time with the fit on. This just seems to fit my ear perfectly. So for me it works, but I can understand why this might be a bit of an issue. It is a little bit on the large side for the shell and the housing as well. But I do like the faceplate, and you can get different custom designs on the original Blessing 2, and you can even get the wood faceplates and stuff like that. I really like this sort of understated, look. I like the way that this, just the default faceplate here, looks with nothing on it. For the cable, this again is a cable that I like. I know there are people who said that they didn't like it, but I find it to be totally functional. It doesn't get tangled, it's not stiff, it's easy to use, it's pliable. I don't have any issues with, the cable being microphonic or anything like that. And it's also surprisingly light, so yeah, I really don't mind. Now, let's talk about how the Moondrop Blessing 2 Dusk sounds and how it's different from the original Blessing 2. And just like the original Blessing 2, it's the same driver configuration. So this is 4 balanced armatures and a dynamic driver to handle bass frequencies. But the main difference between the Dusk and the original Blessing 2 is the tuning. So let's go into that first. Let's talk about frequency response and tonal balance first. And like I said before, if you guys are totally new to frequency response, definitely check out the link in the description for one of the videos that I've done on this subject. When it comes to IEMs, this is very close to what IEMs should sound like. It's not perfect, but it is very close to being perfect. Same thing with the original Blessing 2. That was kind of my assessment of that one as well. Now, for anybody who's wondering, is the Blessing 2 Dusk just a warmer Blessing 2? And the answer is not exactly. There's a little bit more going on than that. So taking a look at the graph here, which is done again on the Gross RA0402 coupler, which dampens the resonance at around 8K. This is a little different in several places from the Blessing 2. So let's start with the bass, and in the sub bass, the Blessing 2 Dusk is definitely more elevated. It's got more presence to it, which is a really good thing. Now you'll note I've normalized this at around 1K. You could normalize this at 300 Hertz, and then it would show a much more significant bass shelf. But if you normalize it at 1K, which I think is probably appropriate for this kind of thing, you'll see that the bass shelf is not only a little more elevated there in the sub bass, but it's also a little bit more well defined because it comes down a little bit quicker. It comes down, closer to 200 Hertz, whereas the original Blessing 2 is a much more gradual shelf there. So it's more contoured on the Blessing 2 Dusk. Now, this has a benefit and it also has a drawback. The benefit is that on the Dusk, the bass is more impactful, more distinct, it's more satisfying, and it works really well for genres that token the full frequency range all the way down in the sub bass, and you feel that, and it's fantastic in that sense. Where this may be a little bit of a drawback is it's not as versatile for recordings that don't fully token those sub-bass frequencies. So if you're thinking like classic rock and metal and stuff like that, it doesn't really always go all the way down into the sub-bass where most of the bass shelf is on the Dusk. And really that means that where there's a bit of a contour there around 200 Hertz in the upper bass, it's going to sound a little bit leaner there in comparison to the original Blessing 2. But for my preferences overall, I think that this is a good change because again, I love that bass being a little bit more distinct. And I do think that this bass elevation is a careful one. It's a very tastefully done one that doesn't go too far. It's really well balanced. It's not a bass head IEM. It's a little bit more elevated than the original Blessing 2, but it's more about that contour and distinctness going on for the bass shelf, and I absolutely love it. Now, moving up into the mids and the upper mids, you can see that on the Dusk, it's a little more relaxed there than the original Blessing 2. It's not like the balance has changed all that much between mids and treble. Starting at around 1.5K, the whole thing's just tilted a little bit more downwards. Now, what does that mean? What does that downward tilt mean? Well, it means that the Blessing 2 Dusk is a little bit more forgiving. It's a little bit less fatiguing in certain areas on certain recordings where the original was. It could be a little bit just bordering slightly on shoutiness there. And with the Blessing 2 Dusk, it kind of avoids that problem. Now, that's not to say that there aren't reasons to prefer the original Blessing 2. If you're listening to piano recordings and you want that a little bit more upper mid-range presence there for the ear gain, then I can absolutely see why a person would want that. When it comes to the treble, especially the lower treble around 6K, there was a bit of an issue for me on the original Blessing 2 where it felt like some of the consonant sounds, like the sh sounds, were being emphasized a little bit. I know not everybody heard this. I know this wasn't an issue for most people, but on the Blessing 2 Dusk, it's still there, but it's like just relaxed a little bit, in part because that whole range is tilted downwards a little bit more. So once again, between upper mids and treble, the balance is the same between the Blessing 2 and the Blessing 2 Dusk. It's just that the Blessing 2 Dusk warms it up slightly. The whole thing is just a little bit more clockwise tilted there. Now, if we take a look at the upper treble, this is another area where the difference between the Blessing 2 and the Dusk becomes interesting. You'll notice that in both cases, the treble rolls off quite significantly, and this is sort of just a limitation on both of these IEMs. I think it's sort of well known at this point, and in fact, many IEMs around this price have this kind of roll off. On the original Blessing 2, where the treble presence stops, so around like 9-10K, it's considerably higher than where the drop off is. Now, this has two effects. The first is that on many recordings, it makes it so you don't notice the roll off as significantly, because if you hear a cymbal crash, for example, it has enough treble presence to sound fully engaging and it doesn't sound muffled or anything like that. But on other recordings, you notice that there is an imbalance there with where the air frequencies should be. And this imbalance is less noticeable or less significant on the Blessing 2 Dusk, but at the same time, because there's not as much treble energy before that, you notice the roll-off on more recordings. So I don't think this is a win for either IEM in this case, at least for treble roll-off and which one handles it better. And I really do think that how much you notice this on either IEM is going to come down to the recording itself and the tracks that you're listening to. So the bottom line here is that in both cases, the upper treble is a bit of a pill that you need to swallow regardless of which one you get. That's not a significant knock against both of these IEMs at this price, just that if we were to nitpick the frequency response here a little bit, it would be that the treble rolls off on both of them. So for the overall tuning for both of these IEMs, they're both excellent in my opinion, and it should come as no surprise, I gave the original Blessing 2 quite a bit of praise when it came out. But of course, the question is, well, which one is better between the two? I'm going to say for my preferences, I prefer the Blessing 2 Dusk. And it's mostly because of the bass shelf that it adds, that makes it a little more distinct there, which I do like. But I can also see why somebody would prefer the original Blessing 2. If you want a slightly brighter presentation, this is the one to go for. If you want a slightly more relaxed presentation, but still present and still balanced, the Blessing 2 Dusk is the one that I would go for. Which one is more neutral? It's really hard to answer that question because that, again, hasn't properly been defined. I think there's an argument for either of them to be the one that's more technically neutral. My other reason for going for the Dusk is that because I was a little bit sensitive to the 6K peak that only like 3 people noticed. Again, most people don't seem to hear it, but I do. I think the Dusk's slightly more relaxed treble, lower treble there, makes it so that that doesn't come across quite as significantly for me. So that for that reason and for the bass shelf, the Dusk is my preference over the original Blessing 2. But the original Blessing 2 is also a phenomenal IEM, and if you want a little bit more presence in the upper mids, you know, if you want a little bit more treble energy there, then the original one would be the one to go for. Now, as far as technical performance, are there any differences? Well, not really. I mean, I think you could probably say, you know, here and there, maybe there's a little more space in the original Blessing 2, you know, and because the frequency response is a little different there in the sub bass, you get a little bit more punch and slam out of the Dusk. But I think when it comes to technical performance, it's a wash between them, and I think that's a good thing. I mean, for both of them, they both have excellent technicalities. You know, while the detail isn't the craziest thing ever, I do think the SA6 is a step up from both of them. The overall sense of layering and depth and space and instrument separation is fantastic on both of them, and I do think they're both benchmarks at the $320 to $330 price mark. It used to be that there wasn't really as much available, you know, under $700, and now there's more stuff out there. So I think the landscape has, even just in the last year, gotten a lot more competitive. So let me do some comparisons here. Compared to the Dunu SA6, I do think the SA6 is like the next step up from these as far as detail is concerned. It's about on par for the punch and slam and, you know, sense of impact, which is surprising considering the SA6 is all balanced armatures and these are hybrids. And then also you have a similar kind of sense of soundstage. I don't really think there's any significant difference between the two. But as far as the tuning is concerned, the SA6 is a lot more like the U12T, whereas these ones are a little bit closer to the Monarch and the Clairvoyance. Oh, a little more closer to the Clairvoyance, actually, for, you know, where the upper mids are. Meaning that for both of these, more so with the original Blessing 2, they're not as forgiving on, you know, certain types of recordings. Like, again, for rock and metal and that kind of stuff, the SA6 is my go-to IEM. I think that's still the best one there for that, and that kind of tuning, so the U12T as well. Whereas these ones, I would consider them technically a little bit more correct, but as I mentioned, they're less forgiving. Now, compared to the The-Audio Monarch and Clairvoyance, those both have better technical performance, they have better sense of detail, but the tuning isn't that different between these and the Clairvoyance. Obviously, on the Monarch, you get a much more significant bass shelf there. The main difference, though, is that the Clairvoyance has way better treble extension. Where these roll off, the Clairvoyance just keeps it going there in the upper treble and the air quality there. But at that point, we are also looking at something that's twice the price, so it's not really a fair comparison, and it's no surprise that those ones do perform better. Okay, let me give a conclusion here. Do I recommend the Blessing 2 and Blessing 2 Dusk at the beginning of 2021? And absolutely, emphatically, I do. I recommend both of these. And if I were to pick one, if someone would just like have one of these and I couldn't, you know, listen to anything else, it would be the Blessing 2 Dusk. I think Crin's tuning choice here was exceptionally well done, and the implementation of it just works really, really well. So the original was great, and I think that the Dusk is just a little bit more fun, a little bit better. And I think the conclusion here, or the takeaway, has to be that when manufacturers collaborate with somebody like Crin, who is very knowledgeable about how IEMs should sound, everybody wins, right? We end up with something that is tuned exceptionally well. And I would love to see more of this happen, maybe at other, you know, price brackets, because this is just something that I think it benefits everybody and benefits the industry as a whole. Anyways, that does it for this video. Thanks for taking the time to watch it, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye for now.